My name is Ghaffar Hussain. I'm head of research at Quilliam. And this is my colleague, Ghaffar Hussain, who's a senior researcher at Quilliam, who happens to be in Leicester today, so you can't got two for the price of one, if you like. Now, although the talk's been billed as Jihadism now and then, I think in the light of some recent events, and the light of some of what we've been through, I think I'm going to try and talk about two different things, and obviously they are linked as well. So first I want to talk about jihadist trends globally, and how they've affected Muslim communities in the UK, so the evolution of Muslim communities in the UK, and how they've been affected by jihadist trends globally. And second, I want to talk a little bit about this thing about offence-taking, and people getting specifically reactionary conservative Muslims making a big deal of certain things that are deemed offensive to them. I think that's been quite relevant to those in recent days and weeks. Now, I want to start by talking a little bit about the background of British Muslim communities, to give a bit of context to what we're going to talk about later. I think it's fair to say the vast majority of British Muslims are the children or grandchildren of migrant workers who came to the UK in the 50s and 60s and 70s at a time when there was a demand for labour post-World War II, when human resources were depleted. So people from the colonies, former colonies like Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, came to the UK as workers. People like my grandfather, in fact. Most of these individuals didn't come to the UK with a view to staying in the UK and adapting and integrating into British life. They came with a 4 or 5 year plan. The idea was you go over to Britain, you work hard in the factory for 5 years, you make money, you go back home a rich man. That was the idea. And many of these were from agrarian communities, so they weren't from the cities in most cases, they were from the villages, people with very little education and skills as well. But as they came to the UK, they settled in, and it was the swinging 60s, of course, so they were better than they thought it was going to be. Now, interestingly, with this first generation, they didn't have an identity crisis. They didn't feel that sense of rootlessness, which their children would experience later, because they were born and raised in a certain culture. They were very sure of who they were and what they represented, what their culture was. So they had a very strong South Asian or kind of Eastern cultural identity. Many of them, I think it's worth emphasising, settled in economically deprived parts of the UK, that's where the work was, of course, in a lot of the factories. Many of them, including my father, experienced a lot of racism, experienced a lot of bigotry, a lot of aggressive racism in many cases, when actually being attacked physically on the streets. And I think that helped shape a sense of solidarity amongst the community, that we need to stick together in order to get by here. So they lived together, they would go all the travelling groups, and they kind of tried to recreate almost a kind of South Asian village life in the UK, which was inherently tribal, inherently patriarchal, you could say, inherently quite insular as well. Now, this generation was very different to the next generation. The second generation had a very different mindset. They were born and raised in the UK. They've not experienced poverty. They've not experienced life in a predominantly Muslim country like Pakistan or Bangladesh. And they didn't have that same sense of identity, that kind of surety of what they were. Because on one hand, they had a culture at home that was very different to the culture they experienced outside of their home. And this creates a sense of dual marginalisation. And what I mean by that term is you go home and you don't fully connect with your parents' generation, with your parents, because they speak a different language, they've got a different set of cultural values to you. And at the same time, you don't fully feel you belong in mainstream society either, because mainstream society doesn't necessarily accept you as a brown person or as a person of different ethnic or religious background. And again, if you experience racism, that can help shape this sense of confusion. So whilst the parents were sure of what they were, the kids were not necessarily sure of what they were. And this created a lot of angst, a lot of pain, and I can say from personal experience, I actually lived through that throughout the 80s and myself. In fact, I had really strange experiences growing up. I used to get attacked a lot. There was a phase in my life where a week wouldn't go by without me being physically attacked. I was raised in the Midlands, actually. That was kind of what it was like in the 80s. And I remember going to a friend's house. I had a friend called Colin, a white chap. And I went around his house, and we were good friends at school. We were playing in his garden. We were playing with cars. And his mum came out and said, "Colin, what's that packy doing in our house?" And immediately I was like, oh, I really shouldn't be here. And I kind of left, and I never spoke up with that guy again. So these kind of experiences do help inform how you see yourself and how you see your position in society, British society. Now, you had the second generation, and I think it's quite a common phenomenon for, I think it's 20-year right theory, as in when a new community comes to a different country after 20 years there's a right. Now the reason why there's a right after 20 years is that's when the second generation is coming of age. And it's starting to demand more than their parents demand, they're expecting more than their parents expected, so they don't put up with a lot of what our parents put up with. So I think that's what happened with many British Muslims when they came of age, when they came to 18, 19, 20, 21. They were having this identity crisis and they were expecting more. Now, a lot of this coincides with another two things that I think are worth mentioning. Firstly, it coincided with Britain itself struggling to make the transition from having an identity based on being a white British, great, almost ethnic identity, to a civic identity where to be British is just accept a set of values and live in a country and be a citizen. And I think Britain itself was making that transition in the 80s and 90s, so this generation were caught in that transitional period. Now, if you go to countries like Denmark and Germany, they're much further behind in that respect. Many Germans believe to be German is to be white. Many Danes believe to be Danish is to be white. If you're not white, you're never Danish, no matter how long you've been there. Whereas if you go to North America, they're much further on in that debate. To be an American or a Canadian is just to be an American or a Canadian to have a passport. No one really cares about how you look or what religion you believe in. So I think Britain was somewhere in between those. So that was that kind of pain being caused by this kind of change, this kind of recalibration of identity. And what fueled the dual marginalisation more was the fact that the parents not only had a different identity, but they had a very static identity. In the sense, if you want to meet the most traditional conservative Brits, go to Spain. Right? Because they went there in the 80s, a lot of them, and they just kind of hung on to their 80s British values, right? And that's what happens, you kind of freeze in a certain moment in time, and then you move to a different country. And that's what happened to a lot of the Pakistanis and Bangladeshis that came here. Their concept of what it means to be an Asian was what it meant to be an Asian in the 70s. So whilst Pakistan and Bangladesh have moved on and developed their own identity, the identity is always alive and evolving, they haven't moved on, they still maintain a very static identity. So that didn't help. And I think what else kind of happening at the same time that all these events in Britain was happening, a lot of events in the world were happening in the Muslim majority countries. Now, what we now call Islamism, that later morphed into Jihadism, was a movement that began in Egypt in the late 1920s. It was actually founded by a school teacher from a small town in Egypt called Mahmoudia, whose name was Hassan al-Banna. Now, Hassan al-Banna was a school teacher who had been exposed to Western education. He was actually quite a big fan of Hitler as well. And he was influenced very much by European totalitarian movements, fascism, communism, these kinds of ideas. Actually translated Mein Kampf into Arabic and called it My Jihad. So he saw Islam, his vision was to reinvent Islam as a totalitarian political project, has used Islam and the state as a tool for social engineering to engineer the perfect Islamic citizens. But this is a relatively new concept, because in Islam there was never a clergy in history. There was never this idea of the state will shape how you behave and act. If you look at the Ottoman Empire, it was relatively easygoing in terms of personal behaviour. They didn't see the Caliphs never sought to regulate personal behaviour in that sense. Each different faith communities had their own courts. Whereas Hassan al-Banna's conception was a complete reinvention. It was actually a merger of Islam with European totalitarian political movements. So he began this movement called the Muslim Brotherhood, Ikhwan Muslimin in Arabic, which is still very much in the media these days, because they came to power recently in Egypt and were then deposed by General Sisi, who's now at the headquarters in London. And so they're in the and he started this movement, and by the late 40s, he had been very successful. He established branches all over the Middle East. He had millions of followers within Egypt itself. They then worked with the Free Officers Movement, which was a military group to overthrow the monarchy in Egypt in the late 40s. They worked together to overthrow the monarchy, established a new state, which was run by the military, which is the same military that still runs Egypt today. Gamal Abdel Nasser was, I'm sure you all remember, was the main leader from that. And when they came to power, the understanding was we worked together to overthrow the monarchy, and then Ikhwan will be given some sort of power within new Egyptian society. But what actually happened was, when the monarchy was overthrown, Ikhwan was crushed. They didn't give them the power they were looking for. And then a member of Ikhwan actually assassinated the then Prime Minister of Egypt. And then there was a huge crackdown on Ikhwan. All the members were arrested, and it kind of went underground for a while. And it emerged later in the 70s as a slightly more moderate movement, although it's debatable how moderate they are today. Now, I'm not going to go on to discussing the details of Ikhwan. What I want to talk about is a diversion that took place at this point. Now, in the early 1950s, Ikhwan managed to recruit a young teacher, and it's always teachers, called Sayyid Qutb. I'm sure you've all heard of a famous book called Ma'qul Tariq, which is milestones in Arabic. Now, Sayyid Qutb was a young teacher. He was sent to America, Green, Colorado to be precise, to monitor the American education system, and to come back and then see what Egypt can learn from the American education system. And when he came back, he wrote an amazing short book. It's called The America That I Saw. And you read this book and you get an insight into this young, very conservative, quite simple Egyptian man trying to understand American society. And he just finds it so baffling. He's really confused by America. And he says bizarre things like, Americans are so obsessed with cleaning their houses and trimming their lawns, and he interprets that as they're devoid of spiritual connection with God because they're so obsessed with cleaning their houses. He talks about how there was music and dancing in churches, and he was so offended that people were dancing in churches. He thought, oh my God, what's happening? This is a place of worship, why are they singing and dancing? He talks in great detail about how American women dress, and how they use lipstick, and how they're so seductive. Obviously, there was clearly sexual frustration was a played a part. So he came back to Egypt, and he was very moved by his experience of America. And when he saw what was happening in Egypt, like Americanization and Coca-Cola signs, and he thought, I don't want Egypt to go down. I don't want Egypt to become a new capitalist haven like America's become. So with that in mind, he joined the Ikhwan Muslimin. So the crackdown I talked about earlier, Qutb was part of this crackdown. He was arrested. He was interned in a Mazakura prison. He was tortured quite brutally. In fact, he had a wild dog set on him. He had a meat pot on his body, a dog set on him. He was a frail young man, so he really didn't take well. No one enjoyed that, but he particularly suffered from that. And eventually, he was given a bit more dignity. He was given a room with some book, with some paper and pens, and he could write. And that's when he wrote Milestones. Now, Milestones is like the Das Kapital of Islamism. And the interesting intellectual breakthrough he made in Milestones was, he said, we have gone wrong. We, the Muslim Brotherhood, have gone wrong. We've been focusing so much on trying to create change from within society, trying to Islamize the society slowly, so eventually people will get up and support Islamist governments. He said, we can't do this. And he brought back a term which was used in the early days of Islam, Jahiliyyah, which means ignorance in Arabic, ignorance. So he said, look, the Egyptian society is so ignorant, they are so far away from true Islamic values, that we can't hope to convince them. So the solution is not to rely on changing society and bringing support from the military. The solution is to build your own military and change society by force. So essentially, he laid the intellectual foundations for Al-Qaeda and Jihadism in that book, which he penned in prison. Now, he was later executed in 1966 in a show trial. His lawyer was actually Ayman al-Zawahiri, current leader of Al-Qaeda's uncle. And Zawahiri at the time said, my life mission is to put his words into action, i.e. what Milestones presented. Milestones is widely available, by the way, if you read it. It's not a very good book, it doesn't read very well, but it gives you an idea of how he is seeking to reinvent Islam as a political project rather than a faith. Now, his brother, Muhammad Qutb, smuggled Milestones out of prison. And at the time, although Saudi is now fully behind the moves to crush the Ikhwan Muslimin that turned against them, but at the time Saudi was supporting the Ikhwan Muslimin. The reason why they were supporting them is when Nasser went to Saudi Arabia, millions of Saudis came out of the streets. So this is the man that stood up to Israel. This is the man who was bringing dignity back to Arab nationalism. So millions of Saudis came out to support Nasser. And the Saudi king saw that and thought, wow, if we go out there, millions of people don't come out to greet us. This guy comes from a different country, comes from Egypt, a million will greet him. So immediately they felt threatened by this guy. So they started supporting the Muslim Brotherhood to undermine Nasser. So what happened was a lot of the educated members of the Muslim Brotherhood were given jobs in Arabian universities, as engineers, as doctors, as lawyers. So not just in Arabia, but Qatar, UAE, all those countries. Now, King Abdulaziz's University in Jeddah was where Muhammad Qutb, Sayyid Qutb's brother, got a position in teaching. He had a young student, 18-year-old young student called Osama bin Laden, who was one of his students, who was obviously inspired by the works of Qutb that we spoke about earlier. He was somebody that also had Abdul Azam as one of his teachers as well at the time. So you can see how these intellectual trends were starting to be shaped. Now, 1979 is a very pivotal year. And I think there were 3 events in particular in 1979 that turned these kind of intellectual, social trends into something very much more concrete. So in 79, they had the Iranian Revolution. You had Khomeini coming to power, overthrowing the Western-backed Shah, who was a very corrupt leader. I don't know, I mean, it's what I've heard. I wasn't there. Probably my uncle was the one at the time, actually, so he had a great time. There was lots of nightclubs and stuff. He really enjoyed himself. Then there was a siege of Mecca, where a group of jihadists led by Juhayman, who was an ultra-conservative extremist, who tried to swore guns in the holy sites for a number of days, and eventually they burst out and said, basically, Saudi Arabia is squandering the wealth of this country, and we demand the imposition of a much stricter Islamic state. So the Saudis had to bring in French mercenaries to flush the people out. And it was quite interesting, actually, because I found it quite funny, because you're not allowed to enter without being a Muslim, the holy sites. So these French soldiers had to convert to Islam to go in there and flush them out. Then they came back and I don't know what happened to them after that, but they had to convert to Islam briefly to convert their operation, which is getting around the details. So you had the siege of Mecca, which at the time, by the way, was blamed on Israel. Typical, this was the Jews doing it, and Jewish ministries attacked around the world. Eventually, most people in the Arab world today still think it was the Iranians. It's really bizarre. But if you go to the Arab ones, who did the siege of Mecca? That's the Shias from Iran did it. That is still what people believe, when there's clear evidence that it was actually Saudis. But Saudis didn't want people at the time to think it was Saudi. And then, probably more pivotal than those two was the war in Afghanistan, the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, which led to Israel supplying Soviet-era weaponry, America supplying money, Pakistan supplying the logistical intelligence, and perhaps some of the world coming to Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. And this was very interesting for a number of reasons. Firstly, it allowed all these different organizations and individuals from all over the world to come together and be in one place at the same time. Talk, discuss, develop their ideas. So you had that going on at the same time. On the other hand, you had many countries trying to get rid of their troublemakers. So look, instead of having a revolution in Iraq, why don't you go over and fight the Soviets? And there's a free train ticket. That's exactly what happened. The Saudis said to me, 70% discount on their flight to Afghanistan. Well, to Peshawar in Pakistan. Just because it was a way of getting rid of all your troublemakers. Go and fight the Soviets, deal with them. And that's exactly what happened. So Pakistan coordinated the whole campaign, brought people over. Bin Laden and Taylor set up a kind of meeting house where we would first go and be settled before they would go off and fight. Osama actually went later on to fight in Afghanistan as well. You can discuss that a bit later. So what happened was they fought the Soviets, then eventually the Soviet Empire collapsed. They withdrew from Afghanistan, and they collapsed because of the war in Afghanistan, but people in Afghanistan convinced themselves it was because of them that the Soviet Empire collapsed, which is not really the case in my opinion. And then they started fighting each other, which is kind of what happens when you get a bunch of jihadis together. They eventually started fighting each other. And interesting, there were kind of intellectual trends again within. So you had Abdullah Azam, who was probably the most influential leading jihadist of the time, but none of them was relatively unknown at the time. But Abdullah Azam was the big shot. And this is the guy who toured America collecting funds, toured Europe collecting money. At that time it was the Good War. Everyone was supporting that war. And after he'd finished, after the Soviets had been defeated, he said, in his own theology, he felt you're only able to fight countries that are directly occupying you. So the Soviets are directly occupying Afghanistan, therefore we can fight them. In his view, Israel is directly occupying Palestine, and therefore we can fight Israel. Zawahiri, Emir Zawahiri, the man I mentioned earlier, who was currently the leader of Al-Qaeda from Egypt originally, former member of the Muslim Brotherhood. Later on, when the Muslim Brotherhood became more moderate, the more extreme factions left the Muslim Brotherhood and went to Afghanistan, formed Tanzim al-Jihad, which went on to become Kamal Islamiyah and various other jihadist groups. He had a very different vision. His vision was the near enemy and the far enemy. That was how he framed it. What he meant by that was the near enemy are our regimes, the Mubarak regime in Egypt or the Saudi regime. They're the near enemy. The far enemy are Western governments, America, Britain, Israel, France. And his concept was we are focusing our energy on attacking the near enemy, but we can't defeat the near enemy because they've got an umbilical cord from the far enemy. So let's take the fight to the far enemy. create chaos in their lands that are part. I mean, turn popular opinion against their support of dictators in our lands, and then we can establish the Islamic revolution. So he had this change where he felt what they should do now is attack the West. And at that stage, Abdullah Azzam didn't agree with that. But Abdullah Azzam was more influential in London. Now, Abdullah Azzam mysteriously died one morning. He was on the way to a Jummah prayer actually in Kabul. The rumour is Zawahiri had him killed. Because once he did die, Zawahiri had complete control over Bin Laden. I mean, Bin Laden was the golden goose. He was the man with the money. He was the man with access to lots of rich people and weaponry. So everyone was after. He wasn't particularly intellectual, but he was the man people wanted for his resources. So Zawahiri won that war. He won that battle. Managed to control Bin Laden, pushed in the direction of attacking the West. And the rest was his history. We have Al-Qaeda and everything evolved from that. Now, you might be thinking, how is this now relevant to what I spoke about earlier in Britain? Well, if we go back to the alienation, we go back to the dual marginalisation, we go back to people not having a firm sense of identity. Someone comes along and says, look, you're not British, because Britain doesn't accept you anyway. You're not Pakistani. Pakistan's a colonial construct invented 60 years ago by Western powers. You're a Muslim. And that is the only aspect of your multifaceted identity that you should emphasise, talk about. And not only that, but it's a new kind of very aggressive Muslim identity, where you have to show people you're Muslim, you have to dress in a particular way, you have to kind of exert this very aggressive Muslim identity. You always want people to know you're Muslim. And you have this phase of people, a certain section of British Muslims who were suffering from that dual marginalisation, who were suffering from this acute sense of alienation from mainstream society. And they embraced this very new, aggressive Muslim identity that was being shaped in Britain. And at the same time, Britain, or specifically London, got the tag Londonistan, which was what I think the French term there. And what they're referring to was the idea that London became a hub for international jihadists from the 90s onwards. A lot of asylum seekers from Syria, from Egypt, who were troublemakers, were seeking asylum in London. A lot of them were accepted in London. And the British government, a lot of the intelligence services' stance at the time was, well, as long as they're not attacking Britain, we don't care what they're doing. So they're openly fundraising for jihadist activities in Algeria outside London mosques. This is what I've witnessed it myself. And no one really cared. So you had this period throughout the 90s, which both of us are, we witnessed this firsthand, where you had a lot of jihadists based in London, Abu Bakr Mohammed, Abu Hamza, some quite familiar names, who were openly preaching hatred of Western societies, hatred of traditional forms of Islam, this very aggressive, militant form of Islam, which there was many people who were susceptible to that. So you had a whole generation of people that were being radicalised in the 90s, but it was all kind of undercover. Nobody knew this was happening. Occasionally you had the media story. Only after 9/11, only after the Iraq War, when there was an explosion of attempts to bomb plots in Britain, people realised, wow, there really is this underbelly of very militant extremist Muslims in the UK. But I think the domestic trends and the international trends came together in the UK and have shaped some of that. Now, that is still happening. Nothing's really changed, to be honest with you. That is still happening. And right now, what's happening in Syria is helping radicalise a whole new generation of people. And it's happening all over again. It's happening now in France as well. I was in Paris a few weeks ago. And French academic told me 700 French citizens have gone to Syria to fight. And the rest of them have gone to join jihadist groups in Syria, including 15-year-old girls as well in some cases. So it's quite remarkable what's happening. Now, that was the first thing I wanted to talk about briefly. The second thing I want to briefly touch on as well, before we get to Q&A, is this idea of outrage. I think outrage, I think being offended and wanting the world to know you're offended is very much part of this aggressive Muslim identity I spoke about. It informs that. It's a scream for attention. It's a way of expressing your identity. It's a way of even gaining political influence. It's like, look, there's the angry mob over there. I'll keep them at bay, but this is what I want. So it's a way political leaders use that. And the first opportunity for that was the Satanic Verses. Now, the Satanic Verses is actually very interesting because Salman Rushdie, when he wrote Midnight Children, which might have won the Booker prizes, was a fantastic book. It was the best-selling book in Iran, actually. In the late 80s, it was very popular in Iran. Now, when he wrote the Satanic Verses, the most offensive thing in the Satanic Verses was a character in the Satanic Verses that's actually a caricature of Khomeini, the Ayatollah of Iran. And because Salman Rushdie was so popular in Iran, and this book was actually attacking the leader of Iran, they were offended by that. The idea that he attacked, it's not a particularly good book, don't get me wrong, I find it pretty hard to read, to be honest. But I think, I'm trying to say this is political. This wasn't a kind of natural reaction. This is something very politicized. So Iran jumped on this. One thing I should actually mention before I get onto that, I forgot to mention, is after the Iranian Revolution, and after Saudi began to exert its influence over the region, a kind of Sunni-Shia proxy war began, where Saudi was trying to exert its influence in different Muslim majority countries, and Iran was trying to exert its influence. Iran was essentially trying to spread the revolution. Iran started funding Shia groups in Pakistan. Then Saudi started funding Wahhabi groups in Pakistan to attack the Shia groups in Pakistan. So now you've actually got a full-blown Wahhabi Shia war going on in Pakistan. They actually go and bomb mosques and kill people. And this is basically a global proxy war between the two. So the Islamic versus was kind of part of that in a sense, where Iran took the lead this time and they go, we're going to show the world that we are the real defenders of Islam, or we're going to issue a death threat for Salman Rushdie. Now, but in a British context, I think certain organisations saw it as an opportunity to come forward and say, okay, well, you've got this very angry Muslim community now, and we represent them because we said so, and you represent us, and we are the gatekeepers of this community. So it allows certain individuals to then position themselves as representatives of the Muslim community, which they weren't at all. Now, that was very dangerous because you can see why they're doing it, because they want obviously political power and influence over the government, but the tragic thing was the government bought into it. It was such a colonial way of thinking, and take us to a leader mentality. It's like, okay, we accept that you represent 2 million very diverse people, by a bunch of 5 middle-aged men. It was bizarre that they accepted that and allowed that to go on for so long. Now, I think the Danish cartoons was a very similar thing. The Danish cartoons was the Danish version of that, if you like. And the Danish Muslim community is obviously in a different position than the British Muslim community. And again, a lot of this is manufactured offence. I mean, when this cartoons first came out, very few Danish Muslims were offended by them. It would pass very quickly. It took 2 imams to compile a dossier of offensive images, add a few extra for spice, including one of a pig squealing contest in France. In France they have pig squealing contests. It's bizarre, but they stick on pigs' head like that. Pig squealing contest. Bizarre. They added a few in there and said, look, this is an example of how they're offending Muslims by sticking pigs on. The guy had a long beard and had a pig on his face. They got, look, there's a nickepin of Muhammad, because they've got a pig on a guy with a beard, which is a French guy with a beard. So you had an exaggerated dossier that was created. Then they were doing a tour around the entire Middle East saying, oh my God, you should be offended by this. Look how offensive this is. You have to be offended. And eventually they whipped up a hysteria, which resulted in many deaths, many attacks on Christian missionaries being attacked in Pakistan, and just lots of like Danish products being boycotted, and just mayhem basically broke out. So you have this kind of pattern now of people, certain Muslim organisations really wanting to vocalise the fact that we're angry, we're really angry, we want you to know that we're angry, we want you to know that. And I wrote an article on this a while ago called The Psychology of the Muslim Writer. And I kind of said that this is actually a very interesting phenomenon because I think for many Muslims, there is a disconnect, there's a cognitive dissonance between their position in the world as it is today, as most Muslim societies are illiterate and not very well developed, I should say, and their perception of what they should be. We have the truth. We have the true Islam. We should be the leading light in the world. And actually they're not. And there's such a disconnect between their self-perception and reality that creates a sense of anger and humiliation. And conspiracy theory is what bridges reality and conceptions of reality. It's something like, well, we are in this position because the West conspired to destroy us and humiliate us. That's why we're in that position. So these kinds of incidents, like the YouTube videos, the cartoons, that's like, you see, the West is humiliating us. And this is an example, this is a manifestation of why we're in such a poor position, because the West keeps attacking and humiliating us. So there's a certain psychology going on within that as well. Now the reason why I wanted to explore this in a little detail is because the organisation I work for, Quilliam Foundation, we've kind of been embroiled in this a little bit recently as well. Osama Hassan has personally been embroiled in this, and he will briefly speak about what happened to him. But I'll quickly talk about my colleague Majid Nawaz, who tweeted a very benign cartoon from a series called Jesus and Mo. I don't know if you've seen that. Now, it was literally a picture of Jesus saying hi, Mo saying hi. That was it. And he tweeted it because someone asked his opinion and said, do you find this offensive? And he tweeted it and said, I am not offended. As a Muslim, I am not offended by this. God is greater than a silly cartoon. And all hell broke loose. And it was really bizarre. It was really strange that such a benign cartoon could create, people had the time in their busy schedules to be offended. Now, I haven't got time to be offended by things. And if I want to be offended, I have to go on the internet and if I've been offended by something. I haven't got time to go and do a campaign against it because I've got a life. Strangely, some people haven't though. And a petition was started and death threats were issued and all sorts of strange things happened. But interestingly this time, there were good things and there were bad things. The bad things were Channel 4 decided not to show the cartoon. Channel 4 decided it's too offensive, which kind of strengthened the argument of the other side. See, even mainstream tells find it offensive. Treat them scared. Right? Why would they say, we're not showing it because we're petrified? Yeah, but instead of saying, we're not showing it because we're petrified, so, well, we're being sensitive culturally. No, you're not, you're scared. So on one hand, you had that. Newsnight didn't show it, which was some progress. But on the other hand, what I found when we got beyond the kind of offence mongers and the people issuing factors, a lot of ordinary people were like, come on, let's grow up. A lot of ordinary Muslims were like, come on. We've had Samuel Rushdie, we've had Sayyid Qutb, let's just all grow up now and get on with this, right? And you also had a lot more non-Muslims and atheists and liberals and liberal Muslims just coming out and defending Mashallah and saying, actually, this is enough, we've had enough of this nonsense, grow up. So just grow up. And that was different. That's never happened before. So I am starting to see some change. People start saying, actually, let's just be a bit more mature about this, which was very welcome. Now, Osama, the reason why I mentioned Osama had a very similar experience. Osama is, as well as a theologian, he's also a scientist. And he's probably one of the first British Muslim scientists to say he believes in evolution. And not only that, but he believes evolution is compatible with his religious beliefs. So what we're going to do now is quickly bring Osama in for 5 minutes to explain what happened when he tried to articulate that idea. And then I'll describe the